So before we jump into this very controversial Torah portion that we are about to talk about today, let's together say our blessing for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך בה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, yadai, dai, dai, dai. And that blessing is really just thanking God for this opportunity to immerse ourselves, to envelop ourselves in words of Torah, and to be able to grapple with the text. And today's text, as I mentioned, is probably, if not, well, I think there's a little bit of competition for where's the most challenging text in the Torah, but this is certainly up on that list, if not number one, pretty close to it. And we're diving in because I know this group is more than capable of doing that. So here we go. Let me share my screen. Whoops. All right. So here we go. We are talking about zealotry. So you can see why I'm saying it's not an easy text. And what we're going to do is we're going to look through Numbers, starting with Numbers chapter 25. Would anyone like to just read these first verses in the English?
I can do it.
Thanks, Irv.
While Israel was staying at Shittim, the people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women, who invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. The people partook of them and worshiped that God. Thus Israel attached itself to Baal, Peor, and the Lord was incensed with Israel.
Okay, so let's pause there for just a second, actually, because we dove right in right there, didn't we? This piece that I just brought in, like basically the story is broken up, the story that we're studying today. The first piece of it, which Irv, you just read, actually comes from the very tail end of last week's Torah portion, and we're about to start the beginning of this week's Torah portion. So what's going on? Remember last week we were talking about Balak and Balaam. Balak was the Moabite king who reached out to Balaam, who was a sorcerer, asking Balaam to curse the Jewish people. And what happened? He ended up blessing the Jewish people instead, perhaps not because he wanted to, but rather because God made that happen. That was the controversy that we were talking about last time. But what ends up happening here is it seems that Balak is actually involved in this other kind of plan to hurt the Jewish people, that there was a lot of fear that the Jewish people was too strong. And so there needed to be something that the Moabites or that others would do to create a problem for the Israelite people. So what's going on here? Well, there's these Moabite women who are coming in to be with the Israelite men. And God becomes really, really angry. Why does God become angry? Well, we know that there are certain things within even the 10 commandments, right? Like there's a lot of commandments within the Torah. There's 613. The 10 commandments are an even more select group, but there's 3 that you never, ever, ever do. under any circumstances. And one of those is it relates to worshiping other gods. And it was thought that by the Israelites being with the Moabite women, that would actually lead them to follow these pagan gods that they are worshiping. So God is really, really, really angry here. Irv, will you go on and read the next few verses?
Okay, the Lord said to Moses, take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord, so that the Lord's wrath may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to Israel's officials, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor. Just then one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions, in sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was checked.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here. One thing it doesn't say directly, but that we can certainly infer from the text is what's happening. All of these comments are coming out, right? God is incensed. God is angry at the people. This is absolutely beyond the pale of what is acceptable. And what happens? Well, this Israelite, and we're going to learn who the Israelite is a little bit later. It happens to be someone who's in a position of status. This Israelite brings a Midianite woman over to the tent of meeting, to the sacred place where God dwells, right? And in front of everyone, he is being intimate with this Midianite woman. And so this is like, not only is this happening, but in front of everyone in the most sacred spot, this is what he's doing. And so the response of Pinchas here is a very, very strong one, to say the least. Anyone have any questions or comments? I know this is a lot to take in right here. Everyone's just, there's no words.
I was just thinking, for me, this does not appear to be a moral issue, where people might be unfaithful to their spouse or anything like that, or anything. It really is, and it says at the bottom, Pinchas, the fanatic, it really is a very extreme, almost fanatical, is that a word? Kind of response. I can understand being upset. People cross the line. I understand God being upset. It all makes sense to me. But a response to this is pretty amazing to me. Pretty dramatic.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. Michael, we can't hear you yet. Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, in my naive reading of this, when one of the Israelites came and brought this Midianite woman over to his companion, you said, did I hear you said that he had sex with her in front of everyone else, or because it just
yes,
says
at the holy spot in front of everyone? Yes.
Oh, because I didn't. I just didn't. I was wondering, well, why did he bring her over? But it didn't exactly say what you said. But
right, it's a euphemism the way that it's written here, but that is definitely what it means.
Okay, that's why I said naive. Okay, on my part. Okay.
Yeah, and just going back to something that you said a second ago, Marla, right? That it's not like someone is like cheating on a spouse or something like that. Well, in the eyes of the Jewish community, it actually was, because it was seen that there is a marriage, there is a covenant between the Jewish people and God. So to do something that would lead someone to worshiping another God was akin to cheating on God. And that was the worst kind of cheating that you could possibly do through this mindset.
I've got a comment.
Yeah.
A question. In the first paragraph from the last week, you talk about the Moabite women, and yet they talk about
Midianite.
Midianite. Are they different?
They are different, but they're connected.
They're what?
They're connected. Basically, there's like 5 different tribes in the area, and the Moabite and Midianite women are like, those 2 tribes are very connected.
And I now realize why in my years in the yeshiva as a youth, they passed this portion. We never learned it.
It's a very challenging portion.
They didn't think kids were old enough to take this on.
Yes. I think it's a very challenging thing for all of us, both because it is very violent and brutal. It's a kind of zealotry that I don't think any of us can relate to or want to. And on top of that, it's just, I mean, it's really, really challenging to even put ourselves in the mindset of this text. Our society is so different. Thankfully.
The text does say that God is pretty angry. Talk about God's wrath. So my question is, was it God's instruction to respond this way, or was it Moses' direction or other people who because of their belief, strong belief, believed this was what they should do? Or did God have anything to do with this? Directly, according to the text?
So great question. I think a lot of our commentaries are going to struggle with that as well. So let's hold on to that. That's a really, really good question to have in the back of our minds.
Well, doesn't it say that the Lord said to Moses, take the ringleaders out and have them publicly impaled earlier?
Yes, there is that statement here.
Yeah.
Right? God does not specifically say to Pinchas that he should do what it is that he does in this moment.
Right. Okay.
So there is a question about what of this is coming from God, what of this is human initiative, and how does that all play out? And there's a huge debate in the text about that. Is there anyone I'm missing? Because I can't see everyone as I'm sharing screen. Okay, so let's look at the text. And I see a few people joined us. It's good to see you, Ray and Tom. There's a few texts here where we explore the idea of Pinchas as a fanatic. And I know Pinchas's name throughout these texts, I took it from their various sources. I understand that there's 50 million spellings thrown in here. Go with it. In Hebrew, it's all the same spelling, but the way people choose to write it in English is obviously not even a little bit consistent. So it's the same person. It's still Pinchas. But we're going to look at a few texts looking at Pinchas as a fanatic and a few texts looking at Pinchas as a person of honor and try to see what we make of those distinctions. So who would like to read this text from the Talmud?
I can read it.
Thank you, Ray.
The elders of Israel sought to excommunicate Pinchas until the Holy Spirit hurried and said, "It shall be for him and his descendants after him a covenant of priesthood for all time, because he took zealous action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites."
Okay, so what do you make of this text?
I'll try.
Yeah, go ahead, Ezra.
Well, it says they hurried and they said, so I don't know. I mean, kind of like descendant, like they're crossing. I don't know. They're trying to get somewhere.
Yeah, so like the descendants after him would be all of the people who come after Pinchas, right? So like his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and all of that stuff. It's coming from this text, this idea that the priesthood, which had been through Aaron and Aaron's family, that it would actually instead start going through Pinchas's family, that he's given this reward, Pinchas, that it's his descendants, all of the people who will follow him, who will actually be the head priests. And so that can be a little challenging there. But the very first part of this, that the elders of Israel sought to excommunicate Pinchas,
Yeah.
can bring in something else. So why are they seeking to excommunicate him?
Well, thou shalt not kill. I mean, he killed him in the name of the Lord, right? But or actually, the Lord spoke to Moses, as you said, but he heard it and interpreted it. But still, you don't kill another person. You shouldn't.
Yeah, right. You shouldn't murder. Is this murder? Right? Because we know that the texts have a big debate over
Right.
killing versus murder, because if you kill someone in war, for example, that's very different from murdering someone.
Yeah, but these were two defenseless people, obviously. I mean, he did it out of outrage, so it could be easily interpreted as a misdeed, that he should not have done that.
Yes.
So, but there's now a force involved saying, because of who he is and what his descendants are going to be, that we should not look at it that way, but we should now think of him doing something holy, something to correct an evil.
Yeah. So we have these two different pieces of this text that are existing side by side, right? We have the elders who are saying, this was not okay, and we don't want someone who's going to act this way within our community. We want to excommunicate him. And then we have the Holy Spirit, an aspect of God, right, that hurries and says, we want to reward him because he stood up and he did this. So we have two things that we're holding at the same time.
I was just curious. So one of the aspects of this, like, I understand that to a certain extent, there's the idea that Jewish people made a covenant with God. One of the very first commandments is that you should not worship other gods or idols. And so the idea behind this would be that in a sense, this is punishment, a capital punishment, and so not murder in the eyes of, I guess, the Holy Spirit. But one of the things I was wondering about is that he kills the woman too. And it's not clear that she knows what's going on or that this isn't okay, because she comes from a religion where it's fine for people to worship many gods and it's all okay. It reminds me of the book of Job, where he goes to the Assyrian town, I believe, and he says, he tells them just to repent, and they don't convert or anything. They just kind of stop being evil. And God forgives them for that. So I guess I know that this is a Torah and that's a later text, but I find it strange, less so that he got killed and more so that God didn't seem to be upset that he killed someone who couldn't have known better.
Yeah, so it's a really, really good point, Brian. And actually next week's Torah portion, there's a lot of pieces in the portion that talk about women and how they're given blame and the position of women within society. And we're going to get into that a little bit. So
Let me ask
very,
you-
very good point. I originally had a text in here relating to exactly what you just said, and I ended up taking it out and put it in next week's Torah portion. But it is a really, really important point.
So Job's not Jewish?
Job is Jewish.
What about the woman here? She
Well, yeah, he's talking about the Midianite woman who's with this man, right? And the Midianite woman absolutely wasn't Jewish. That was the point. And so she's being killed. Did she know that she was doing that? Like, was this her fault? I mean, there's a lot of really big questions there. Did she really deserve to die? I mean, you could even ask, did this man deserve to die? Was this actually an okay thing in any way? But just the way it's presented here, Brian, I think brings up a really fair point.
And she wasn't a ringleader, which was what was being asked for, to get the ringleaders and to execute them. She certainly wasn't a ringleader. She was collateral damage.
Yeah, there's a little bit of debate about that, just because she was a person of status within the Midianite community, according to some of our like commentators. But so there's a slight debate about that, but she certainly isn't a ringleader within the Jewish community.
I have one comment about in the first paragraph was until the Holy Spirit hurried and said, it'd make more sense to me if it said, instead of Holy Spirit, public opinion or the community said, the community rallied around. I just don't see the hand of God coming down and doing that.
Well, it's God who dictates who becomes priest according to our
Yeah.
Torah text, right?
Right.
So this is saying that God decreed that it would be the priesthood would come from Pinchas's
Okay.
family.
Okay.
Rabbi, I have a question. Something just hit me as I was reading that. So in our time, when someone commits a crime, even as heinous as murder, he or she is punished accordingly. But I'm asking in biblical times where it says it shall be for him and his descendants. So were the descendants literally punished generation after generation for the acts committed by a person prior to their being alive, or in previous times?
Also, a really, really good question and a somewhat complicated one. There is a text in the Torah that talks about, and we even say it during the High Holy Days, that like misdeeds go on to the next generation and the next generation, but good deeds are for many, many, many generations. But at the same time, there are contradictory texts that say, no, the only people who should be punished are the perpetrators themselves. So there's an ongoing debate within Jewish literature about how that works.
Rabbi,
Well, okay, I was just going to say, but can you imagine what a great world this might be, that we could have, I don't want to bring up the word guns, but anyway, if their descendants were punished and they had a conscience and they cared about their descendants and current relatives, they would maybe think twice about committing terrible acts, or maybe they think more than twice. But now it's in our time and previous generations, it's just that person is as we know, imprisoned or executed. And the descendants, yes, oh, you must be the mother of that man who killed someone or whatever. But after a while, maybe the bad reputation dies down after a while. But it just seems like this idea about the descendants in biblical times really kind of hit me in that way.
Yeah, I think there's so much more to discuss here, Michael, that I would love to, but I
Okay,
need to
well,
bring us back to this for now. But we'll discuss this more another time because I think it's a
okay,
really, really
thank
good
you.
discussion.
Thank you.
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Is this time frame now pre-Sanhedrin, or does the Sanhedrin exist at this time?
So this is from the Talmud. This particular text is from Sanhedrin in the Talmud.
Okay.
So it exists. Yeah.
Okay, so I go back to what I learned many years ago, that the Sanhedrin was very reluctant to execute anybody for any crime. They were, if they did execute somebody as a penalty, they were called to kill the Sanhedrin. I don't know where this comes from in my history, but they would be called to kill the Sanhedrin for time, because they took even a criminal's life. So that kind of flavors it a bit for me.
Yeah. Ezra, did you want to say something? I wasn't sure if your hand was up. Okay, if you do, feel free to unmute. I actually am going to have us jump around a little bit because I think that it can be very difficult to see into the mindset of the rabbis in the Talmud and even this Torah text about why Pinchas's deeds were considered positive by some people. That all of us, and understandably so, and I think rightfully so, see this and say, this is messed up, this is not okay. But I think we also need to put ourselves in the mindset of the people involved. So I want to look at this section on Pinchas the Honorable, and then we'll go back up to the other texts. So just to start with, to kind of set the stage for this text by Rabbi Kook, what he does is he refers to a text that's part of our weekday liturgy, which is a prayer, Haminim, which is the prayer against heretics, is how it's often written. Here they translate it as against enemies. So the prayer says, let there be no help for informers, and may all wickedness instantly perish. May the enemies of your people be swiftly cut off, and may you quickly uproot, crush, root, and subdue the insolent speedily in our days. Blessed are you, Adonai, crusher of enemies and subduer of the insolent. And so Rabbi Kook kind of writes about this while thinking about Pinchas's actions. And he says, any sage distinguished for his piety and learning is capable of formulating prayers, breathing sentiments of mercy and love. But such a prayer as this one, this prayer against enemies, so full of hate and condemnation, is bound to arise the private feelings of animosity and spite on the part of the author against the enemies and persecutors of his people. Such a prayer must therefore originate with one noted for the holiness and purity of character and entire lack of passion of hatred. Such a man was Samuel HaKatan. One could be sure that he was dominated by a completely unselfish considerations and inspired by the purest of motives, and had removed from his heart all private feelings of hatred for the persecutors of his people. Why am I bringing this text in? Because the underlying message here is that perhaps Pinchas wasn't acting from a place of anger, wasn't acting from a place of hatred, but was instead inspired by the purest of motives and had removed from his heart all private feelings of hatred.
I have something to say.
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
Isn't this blessing so-called the Birkat Hamonim? And it was written about the turn of the century, written about when Christianity was formed. And it was really aimed at the Christians. It was aimed at those people who were going to accept Jesus as a savior. So
I don't know if that is completely accurate.
that's the understanding I have from several different sources. So
yeah, I don't know that it was aimed specifically against Christians. I think it was aimed against anyone who was viewed as a heretic. And that could have included Christians, but it wasn't specifically against Christians.
It was written about 90 AD, as about the time that Jesus was here. And it drew reactions later on from some of the disciples, for example, and even the name. It's the blessings of the heretics.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very controversial one. It used to be considered the 19th blessing. Now it's the 12th blessing, I believe. It's fascinating history, and the way Rabbi Kook uses it is kind of interesting. Yeah. So it's hard to find this in the prayer book because we don't usually list all 12 of the Amidas. So we usually
it's in every prayer book. It's only in the weekday blessings.
That's right, only in the weekdays. So that's why a lot of people don't see it. I had a hard time finding it when I was told it was there. Right. It's interesting. It's very interesting to see it here. Rabbi Kook is an interesting character.
He is. I'm kind of curious from everyone else, what do you make of Rabbi Kook's kind of idea about this? That Pinchas doesn't have to do with anger, and instead has to do with the purest of motives. What could pure motives here possibly be?
I mean, a pure motive could be saving people from God's wrath by doing this sort of thing, but that just, you know, brings over the whole philosophical can of worms about, can you do things if you think it will save people from other stuff? And relatively relevant for us, considering that history has been full of people that killed us thinking that was best for society. So.
Mm-hmm. Everything about these texts is morally complicated and really challenging. It is a can of worms.
Yes.
Anyone else?
Mhm.
Well, let's look at a few other things here that brings in another piece. And this goes back in some ways to Marla's original, or a statement that Marla made a little bit earlier. So Samson Raphael Hirsch said, Pinchas acted meritoriously only because he punished the transgression in flagranto, in the act. Had he done it afterwards, it would have been murder. So because it was in the middle of this action that he killed Cosby and the Midianite woman, I know we haven't learned their names yet, but then because of that, it was okay. And on top of that, we come to this text from Sanhedrin, going back again to Talmud Bavli, where it says, moreover, if Zimri is the Israelite, Cosby is the woman. Moreover, if Zimri, son of Salu, had separated himself from the woman, and only then Pinchas killed him, Pinchas would have been executed for killing him, because it is permitted for zealots to kill only when the transgressor is engaged in the act of intercourse. Furthermore, if Zimri would have turned and killed Pinchas in self-defense, he would not have been executed for killing him, as Pinchas was a pursuer. One is allowed to kill a pursuer in self-defense, provided that the pursued is not liable to be executed by the court. So what do you make of his argument? Because it's certainly an interesting one. Was he acting on his own accord? Everyone's very quiet. Did I scare you all with these texts? Do you think the timing changes anything?
It sounds like he was permitted to kill because he killed him while Pinchas was in the act of intercourse with that woman.
Mm-hmm.
So sounds like, hey, it was okay to do that.
He stopped it right there in the moment.
Right.
You know, I hope this doesn't sound too silly or pediatric, and usually I don't keep this in my mind when I'm studying Torah with all of you, but I'm reminded, this particular thing reminds me that probably Torah was written by men. Probably men are excused more frequently, even more zealously than perhaps women ever are forgiven for their transgressions. And that's what popped up for me. That's where I am. I don't normally feel that.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing pediatric about that. And it goes to exactly what Brian, you were talking about earlier. I think this doesn't feel fair or right in any way.
I think for me, reading this, like, I understand the kind of almost legal argument, loophole argument here is that, like, well, if he wasn't in the middle of it, if he had immediately stopped, then it wouldn't have been okay to kill him, and also it would have been okay to defend himself. But I guess I'm struggling to see how it matters if he had stopped in that moment. Because, like, if the question is giving like, they have an opportunity to reform themselves or something like that, then possibly. But you could also stop someone from doing the act and not kill them and accomplish that. So I think that's what kind of, even in the logic of ancient Israelites, it's a little hard for me to understand.
Yeah, and to that point, we had a recent bat mitzvah girl who had a text where God was responding to a rebellion, and all of these people weren't even given a chance to repent or change. They were just killed. And she said, "This isn't the God that I'm familiar with from the Torah. God teaches all of these morals. Why isn't God doing it?" And it was a really fair question to ask. And I think that's exactly what's coming up here. Like, there's got to be another solution other than killing these two people in sight of everyone else, right? This is not a highlight or a really high moral text within Jewish tradition from my perspective, that's for sure. But I still think it's important that we wrestle with all of it because it can give us insight into where we were as a people thousands of years ago. I want to go to a couple of other texts here. So this is Targum Jonathan. This is slightly later time-wise. It says, because Phinehas had taken the spear with his arm, prayed with his mouth, and struck sinners in the inwards, the Torah provides that the priest received the sacrificial gifts of the shoulder, the cheekbone, and maw. And indeed, we have this verse from Deuteronomy that'll happen a little bit later saying, this then shall be the priest's due from the people. Everyone who offers a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep, must give the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach to the priest. So those are the parts of the animals that will go to the priest. And it's saying it comes because Phinehas was praying with his mouth as he did this. The Torah does not indicate that he was praying at this moment, but that's what they're reading into it. Okay. So some of the text we actually didn't even get to yet, but that we'll go back to in a minute, talk to the idea that Pinchas is acting here because Pinchas knows how angry God is. And Pinchas knows that if nothing is done, a lot more people will be killed. But as we saw a little bit earlier in verse 8, whoops, there we go, that when he stabs both of them, the plague against the Israelites was checked. Many, many lives were saved. And so his action in this moment is to bring down God's anger so that it can be taken care of in that moment. And Pinchas is rewarded for acting in that moment because many lives were saved. This is also very, very murky moral waters here, but it is something that the rabbis bring in. So with that kind of backdrop in mind, I want to go back to a couple of other texts about Pinchas the fanatic. Would anyone like to read this piece from Torah Gems?
I'll do it.
Thanks, Brian.
When Moses saw how great Pinchas was, he was afraid that he would be chosen as the leader, but he was not pleased with the prospect of having such a zealot as the leader of the Jewish people. He therefore asks of God that the leader be a tolerant person and not a zealous person. Or zealous one.
Yeah, so essentially, Moses saw that Pinchas's actions saved people. He's a decisive person. He's not like hesitant to jump in and do what needs to be done. He's being rewarded for his actions in this moment. And Moses said, I know I'm not going to be the one to bring the people into the land of Israel. God's already told me that. We're trying to figure out who the next leader will be. please, God, don't make it be Pinchas. Because even though he is decisive, even though he's rewarded for his actions, he is not the kind of temperament of a person who should be leading our people.
Where does the quotation of Moses asking that come from?
This is, trying to remember it. Yeah, it appears in Torah Gems. I thought I had included more information in here than that. I'd have to go back to the book. I can't tell you off the top of my head.
No problem.
It's definitely midrashic text, so later texts. Okay, so the idea that Moses is saying this in this moment is fairly controversial in its own right there, right? God is rewarding him and Moses is saying, please, no, this is not okay. And similarly, we have another text, this is a midrashic text from Numbers Rabbah, saying, Moses requested of the Holy Blessed One at the hour of his death, saying before God, Master of the universe, the mind of each and every one is known before you, and none of them are the same as another's. When I am separated from them by death, I ask you to please set someone over them who will be patient with each one according to their uniqueness. In other words, Pinchas is not that person. Please have what matters in mind, God.
So I have an interesting question.
Yeah, go ahead, Ezra.
Does God know that you're going to be dying?
Well, God told Moses that Moses wouldn't be leading them into the land.
No, I'm saying if someone's dying, does God know that your time's going?
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question, Ezra. Yeah, that is absolutely something that there's a lot to talk through there. I'm not sure it falls directly in this particular Torah study, but I'd love to find a time where we can dive into that because it's a really good question. And it's also a very good High Holy Day themed kind of a question.
These interpretations make me appreciate Moses more for his leadership skills, the thoughtfulness that it takes when a leader is not going to lead anymore and has to find his or her replacement. And I appreciate what he's saying. And that's hard to define. And it's probably what each of us do when we go to vote for a leader. We look at substance, what the leader does, and then we look at how the leader does it. And both those things are important to us in modern times. In historical times or times, Torah times here, I'm appreciating Moses more. I don't think well, part of it is because I agree with him. So if I agree with you, I like you, and I think you're right. That's pretty dumb. I just thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, the other piece of that, like the spinoff of that, Marla, is also we need different leaders for different scenarios. So from the tradition, from the interpretation of some of these rabbis about Pinchas, or from the Torah, Pinchas is the right leader at this moment for this thing. We might totally disagree with that. I know I do. I don't think this was okay in any way, shape, or form, right? But from their perspective, Pinchas was the right leader in this moment. But Pinchas is not the right leader going forward. So I'm going to bring us down a little bit more so that we can read the second half of this text. Would anyone like to read the rest of these verses?
Sure.
Thanks, Ezra.
Where do I start?
From he followed.
Okay, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites were checked. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Pinchas, son Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest who turned back my war from the wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them for his passion for me, that he did not wipe out the Israelite people into my passion. Saying, therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. It shall be for him and descendants after a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took in passionate action for his God, thus making what?
Expiation.
For the Israelites. The name of the Israelite who was killed, the one who killed the Mennonite woman, was the Zemra Zu, son of Zu, Chephlin of Semonite, as general house. The name of the Mennonite woman who killed was
Cosby.
daughter of Zar, was the treble head of the Ezra general house in Madden. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Zeniel, the Mennonites offended them, for they aligned you by the thickets, picketed against you because of the fair of the poor, the fair, their kinswoman, Cosby, daughter of Mennonite, Chephlin, was killed at the time of the plague, count of the poor.
Thank you so much.
I don't know why I struggled with that one. Sorry.
There's a lot of names and all sorts of things thrown into this. That's easy for absolutely no one, Ezra. You did a great job. So, yeah, it's giving Pinchas kind of a pat on the back here for acting in this way. Any comments on these verses?
How does the trickery play into that? How do they know that she was tricking them? I mean, how does this, I mean, it's all interpretation. So again, the woman gets the blame for maybe something that wasn't there. It's fascinating. And boy, have little
Yes.
things have changed. That's all I'll say. It's definitely still a man's world.
Yeah, so it's a really, really good question. And again, this goes back to what Marla and Brian, both of you were talking about, right? That there are some different midrashic texts and interpretations on this, that this was all a very well thought through plan. That Korach and Balak, not Korach, sorry, Balaam and Balak got together with all of these women and created a plan to hurt the Jewish people, and they're all working together in order to hurt the Israelites. So she's a part of it. How much we buy that, I don't know, but that's the underlying kind of message that's coming through here. And even if she knew it, whether she had control,
I don't know where I stand on all this God stuff anyway, but to have such a vengeful, mean-spirited when the tempers flare or whatever, it's so hard. And so much of this is so pertinent to what's happening today. That's what I take out of all of this. But you hear God is love, God is this, God is that, but boy, he's had his moments in our history not so nice.
100%. And I think there's actually so much power in that, right? If God, who is good and moral, can do these things that feel anything but good and moral, then perhaps we who are good and moral need to look within ourselves so that we can be fully aware of what we're capable of doing. But it doesn't feel very good, that's for sure.
So I actually wanted to ask something, since you're talking about morality and the ability for humans to be as moral creatures to look through within themselves for it, and Ray was just mentioning that, obviously God was pretty angry in these parts. I think a lot about, obviously, Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham arguing with God. And I also think about the passage you just did with Moses, with him saying, don't let this be the leader that we end up having and stuff. And I was just curious about, like, I'm sure this will vary as far as people's opinions, but how much do people have the opinion that your opinions in a sense can differ from God's in Reform Judaism, just because there are instances of people arguing with it, but also people could argue that God knew there was no one in Sodom and Gomorrah to save, so that's why Abraham's arguments, he just kind of placated them. So I'm not sure. I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the people who are chosen as leaders were chosen as leaders specifically because they had the chutzpah to argue with God. And yes, you can make that argument about Sodom and Gomorrah. God knew anyway, so it was just, for show. But I think it actually was deeper than that, because then why even have the dialogue, right? But I mean, this is definitely, if not the most challenging text in the Torah. It's very, very high up there because it's so counter to what we associate with and what we want to associate with Judaism. But I want to bring us a little bit further in, because I know this text has thus far been very negative, and understandably so. And I want to bring us to a little bit of a better place. I don't think that there is totally an upshot to this text. I think it's just a troubling, hard text. But I want to bring us to something. So in Psalms, it says, Pinchas stepped forth and intervened, and the plague ceased. It was reckoned to his merit for all generations to eternity. So putting this emphasis again on the fact that he was able to end this plague. I want to go a little further. I'm going to go through these texts kind of quickly just because I'm noticing the time and I want to get us to one specific point. Sorry, if I don't move enough in the office, the lights all go out. So that's what just happened. The Torah states that the crown of God's favor was bestowed on Pinchas, and that because he had shown himself zealous, his descendants would inherit the priesthood forever. This presents the reader with the serious moral question of how such a priceless reward could be given for an act of killing. Pinchas is rewarded not so much for slaying the transgressors as for saving his people from God's destructive wrath. Pinchas's impulsive deed was not merely a kind of battlefield execution, but reflected his apprehension that the demands of God needed human realization and required a memorable and a dramatic example against permissiveness in the religious realm. The story further asserts that this was the proper way to halt further religious disintegration and to repair the breach of the covenant. I am sure a lot of us wrestle with this statement. Like, does that mean it's okay? Like, no, probably not, right? But this is the argument that's coming from the text. I'm going to go forward just really fast. I'm trying to see. Let me see if I could just move ahead quickly. All right, let's go ahead to Naphtali, Zvi Yehuda Berlin. In reward for turning away the wrath of the Holy One, blessed be God, he blessed him with the attribute of peace, that he should not be quick-tempered or angry, since it was only natural that such a deed as Pinchas's should leave in his heart an intense emotional unrest afterwards. The divine blessing was designed to cope with the situation and promised peace and tranquility of soul. So what is this going back to? Essentially, let me just go up really fast. There's shalom that it says here. Yeah, here it is. At the end of verse 12, it says, I shall grant him my pact of friendship. And the word that's given is briti shalom, which really means a covenant of peace. So yes, he's rewarded for this action, but what is he rewarded with? Peace. He's rewarded with the ability to not just respond in anger and not respond in the exact way that he did in order to earn this reward. So it's kind of interesting in how it plays with that. And going just a little bit further here, this also comes from the Talmud. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, the verse, Numbers 25:12, the one that we just looked at, and therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, shalom. when he is shalem, whole or complete, and not when he is chasers, missing something, diminished. But hey, the Torah wrote shalom. Said Rabbi Nachman, the Vav of shalom is written broken. That in the Torah, this Vav should actually be written in two pieces because it's showing that at this moment, he is doing anything but indicating a state of shalom. He needs to find that shalom within himself, but something is broken here. If this is the response, and this is what we are uplifting as something that's positive, there is something that's broken, and it needs to be indicated as such in the Torah, which is kind of an interesting thing for the rabbis to be saying here. Two more really quick things, and then we can talk about it. So another text from the Talmud. Pinchas did not become a priest until he had made peace among the tribes, between the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh and the rest of Israel. So it's saying here, he wasn't making peace. Here, he was killing someone. Whether that was murder or not, perhaps there's some debate, but he was killing someone. That's not a way to achieve peace. The only way that he could receive this priesthood, yes, ultimately he will, but he didn't earn it until he learned how to create peace. And that's what that Briti Shalom is all about. And the one last thing here from Iturei Torah is after the great zealousness that he acted upon for God, God gives him as a gift this covenant of shalom. It is as if the Torah is hinting that the path of shalom is always preferable to and more successful than the path of zealousness and war. So I know we're wrestling. This is a lot of text, but any kind of reflections or comments based on all that stuff that I just threw at you?
I think it's go back. It sounds to me like a literary drama that was set up by the authors. You know, and say, how crazy can I get to make this point? How am I going to get some attention? So it's got to be something like sex and killing, and then really what we're after is how the players react to what's going on. What's the end result? Peace. We're after peace, and we want to get rid of this plague. And how are we going to satisfy the storyline? And it sort of plays in my head. I think they do a good job. It gets a little outrageous, but I think they do a good job.
So it's literary technique, is what you're saying.
Yes, yes.
Well put, Irv. Well put.
I was thinking, I think it was verse 12 where it talked about Pinchas acting upon the passion of God. So that made me realize it wasn't God as master of the universe, God as the predictor, all-knowing of what's going on, but rather the emotional level. And, we talk in educational terms about emotional intelligence. I don't think it necessarily applies here because it's quite interpretive by these folks that have interpreted the Torah for us that we're learning about today. But I guess the caveat for me is that when you make decisions that cause you to act on behalf of others, to be concerned that you're acting, if you're going to hold somebody else accountable and the reason why you're doing it, careful that it's just simply not their passion. That it might be more than that. If it is good to get rid of the plague, that makes sense to probably all of us to stop the plague, right? But he didn't say that. It was like Irv saying, it's kind of after the fact.
Yeah, and to Brian's point before, perhaps that could have happened without people needing to be killed.
There's also a leadership issue there that I thought was really well covered. You need one kind of leader when you're going to war, and you need one kind of leader when you're trying to govern. And even in the Godfather movie, they did the same thing. They took a key player out and said, well, we needed you here. Now we need somebody else because we're going to war. We don't want you. So I think it's on reflection, I was when I looked at it and read it beforehand, I thought, I'm going to not like this at all, but I think I'm warming up to
So you're saying that Pinchas is the original godfather?
it. Yeah, well, yeah, because he, well, maybe one of the strong leaders, Moses is the godfather. But
Okay.
Pinchas, he said, okay, Pinchas, he did that, but we don't need Pinchas anymore. We need somebody, it's reversed. What happened? We need somebody to govern now. We don't want anybody impulsive that's going to go around killing people just because they're doing something stupid. So, I think there's a leadership lesson there as well as what I said before.
Yeah.
Good.
I think this text can give us a whole lot to wrestle with. I know I wrestle with this text quite a bit, and I hope that we'll continue to do that. Next week's text, it's not as violent as this one. That is for sure. There are much more redeeming things in next week's text than this one, but there also are some infuriating things relating to gender. So we'll get into all of that next week. And Marla, I wonder if you can finish today with some words of blessing.
Yes, thank you for asking. This is just a little bit later, Numbers 27, verse 6. And it has to do with the daughters and their inheritance or not inheritance of the land. The plea of the daughters is just, is the verse. So, this blessing is for justice. Give voice to your heart's demands for justice and truth. Be aware of your own rights. Let no one diminish you, least of all yourself. Do not deny your own value. Speak up for yourself as the daughters did. Shake off the plague of powerlessness and rise above ambivalent feelings to ride the rising tide of your own convictions. The Holy One moves through you and guides you towards justice and right action. Know that your sense of what is fair and just is God calling you to stand up for yourself and for others. You are not alone. Your voice will be heard.
Beautiful. And that also will relate to next week's Torah portion, because Zelophehad's daughters will make a little comeback and we can get into all of that and talk that through. So thank you for bringing that in. And thank you all so much for a great Torah study today. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Hope to be there for Yom Kippur.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.